As a result of Nixon's visit to China, the U.S. recognition of Communist China began to be set in motion and created an American liaison in Beijing, started diplomatic recognition of the country, and began to move into a period of calmer calmer relationship in a foreign diplomacy with China. The Russians are going to also want a policy with the United States, so we come up with the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. There were two of them, SALT 1 and SALT 2. Brezhnev is going to agree to them. SALT 1 limits the two powers to 200 anti-ballistic missiles on two sites each. Also, SALT 2 is going to freeze the number of offensive ballistic missiles for 5 years, trying to stabilize the arms race. This showed a mutual desire to reduce Cold War tensions. It was symbolic of movement to control the nuclear arms race and settle our differences peacefully. Nixon and Brezhnev both agreed to work for an era of peaceful coexistence and maybe even lead to a time of disarmament. The tension between the two was at an all-time low. For ending the Vietnam War, Nixon had a three-part plan to gradually reduce the number of American troops. In 1969, we had a little over 500,000 troops. In 1972, we go down to less than 30,000. It was known as Vietnamization, withdrawing troops, giving them money, weapons, training, shifting responsibility from American troops to the South Vietnamese. Also intensify American bombing, most controversial part of the plan. Taking a very hard line with the peace talks, trying to negotiate with Hanoi. Kissinger had secret meetings with North Vietnam foreign minister. Nixon is going to send B-52 raids to North Vietnam, trying to change the agreements and agree on a truce to release American POWs if the U.S. would remove their troops from South Vietnam. 1970, there was the invasion of Cambodia, trying to undermine the communist sanctuaries at the border. Nixon is going to order air and ground strikes into Cambodia, targeting their communist supply lines, about 3,500 secret bombings, a lot of protests at home. Also led to the War Powers Act, was passed despite his veto, required him to report to Congress within 48 hours of military action. Congress needed to approve any action taken so that we didn't have this free reign of whatever the president wanted to do anymore. One of the home protests that resulted was Kent State in Ohio, the student protest involving the bombing of an ROTC building on campus. And the Ohio National Guard came on campus, and when trying to corral the revolt, ended up shooting 4 students and wounding 11. Nixon called them bums who were trying to blow up the campus, and it was a really bad PR moment. More student protests broke out in over 400 campuses, including Harvard, Yale, and Cornell. And people view this as the students, not the National Guard's fault. Nixon sides with the silent majority rather than the protesting students. Peace talks in 1973 led to a disguised American surrender. After 8 years of fighting, we emerged from South Vietnam, and Hanoi signs a treaty after the bombings. POWs from the U.S. are returned. We withdraw our troops from South Vietnam. Eventually, we're going to keep some troops there negotiating the surrender, but we do withdraw a lot of our numbers. For the crisis of democracy, administration at this point was characterized by deceit for Nixon. We had the attempted use of FBI and CIA to go against our enemies. 5 men are going to break into the Democratic headquarters, worked for CREEP, C-R-E-E-P, known as a Committee to Re-elect the President. And this one had grown out of the paranoia in Nixon's presidency. He had hired a group called the Plumbers, trying to use illegal means to keep leaks of information from getting out of the White House, and also to discredit his opponents. Pentagon Papers were one of the causes of creating the Plumbers. The Pentagon Papers, no matter how much Nixon had tried to keep them from coming out, the New York Times had published a series of leaked Defense Department reports on the Vietnam War, showing lies, misreports on American policies, and led to Nixon employing his group to try to stop that from happening again. There was the condoning of criminal activities in the 1972 election, wanted ministers to prepare an enemies list that he had. Nixon will be arrested. Nixon's agents are arrested in 1972 for the attempts to break into Watergate. Howard Hunt, former agent from the FBI, G. Gordon Liddy, the guy that's in the picture here, They were involved, were arrested without committing anybody else on the policy of Watergate, but this is not the last that we're going to talk about it. All right, so the election definitely was not nearly as close as the last one. Nixon's opponents were third party George Wallace, who was actually shot and paralyzed during the presidential race, Democrat George McGovern. His nomination and his policies are actually going to alien him from the middle class. He wanted to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. He wants the right to abortion, tolerance for diverse lifestyles, and middle class saw him and his income redistribution as anti-establishment and tend to go more towards Nixon. Nixon also lets him play up his extremism and leaves a lot of his campaigning to others. He was really painted on as an extremist, emphasized his foreign policy, Nixon's foreign policy as his strength, and Nixon will win a landslide, took 61% of the popular vote in every state but Massachusetts. The Republican Party makes a big gain in the Sun Belt. Democrats are going to include the minorities and low-income voters. The re-election committee, as part of it, not necessarily needed with all of the popularity that he had going into this election. All right, so what was going on with Watergate? The re-election committee, CREEP, broke into the Democratic Party headquarters to bug their office in line with Nixon wiretaps. Nixon had wiretaps on reporters, White House aides, and were hoping to get something to discredit his opponents, especially to find out secrets on some of the people coming up against him. And when the Senate hearing was going on about the cover-up, Senate appointed a special committee to review the cover-up. John Dean, one of the White House aides, refused to be the scapegoat, and so he was fired, and it admits that the president was involved in the cover-up. Then they start investigating the White House and realized that there were Oval Office tapes, White House tapes, that Nixon had recorded his conversations with people and taped all the conversations going on what would ultimately, this is what's going to bring him down. He tried to invoke special privilege, keeping them. When the prosecutor asked for the tapes, Nixon fires him, and then his replacement asked for the tapes and tried to only give up a few of them at first, and is going to have a Supreme Court ruling unanimously that the tapes need to be given over for the judge. U.S. versus Nixon, 1974, deny him the use of executive privilege to keep those tapes for himself. The House Judiciary Committee recommended impeachment on 3 counts: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Also showed several independent parts of the government. We're talking about the different strengths that had come out during this, and Nixon will ultimately resign in 1974. Faced with the release of the tapes, he was forced to resign. There was no solid proof he was involved in illegal activities, but did engage in a legal cover-up. And the political climate at this point was already a little tense because his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned for taking bribes from the governor of Maryland and had so formally resigned as vice president. And when a vice president resigns, the president gets to appoint somebody new. So he had appointed Gerald Ford, and now Ford will take over the presidency, having never been elected in any aspect. So Watergate had demonstrated the growing power of the presidency, showed the abuse of power and presidential authority, the drive for power, not money. There'd been a lot of other presidential scandals that we've looked at over the course of history that we've looked at so far, but this one, especially having the ability of reporting and television, had really played this one up quite a bit. Realized that the presidency, the Nixon, when he had barely gotten it the first time, asked the plumbers for secrecy, directs the IRS and Justice Department to punish his enemies, reward his friends. It illustrates the strength of other institutions in the government. The press, investigative reporting could unlock heavily guarded secrets, the federal judiciary protecting individual freedoms, Congress rising to the occasion and carrying out investigation of executive misconduct, and a nonpartisan impeachment case. Also, one of the long-lasting effects was destroying the trust in the government. Attorney General John Mitchell and 27 presidential aides were sentenced to jail terms. People were intent on expanding congressional authority, and they're just going to have a long-lasting distrust of the government and their actions. On the economy side of the era, U.S. had a life based on cheap energy. American-made cars were gas guzzlers, and when we're faced with an Arab oil boycott in 1973, the supply and price of fuel is threatened as war breaks out in the Middle East and we're fronted with scarcity for the first time in a while. The Yom Kippur War, or the October War, Egypt and Syria had launched an attack on Israel, trying to get back some land that had been taken during the 6 Days War. Yom Kippur is Jewish holy day, and so it really catches people off guard. Results in the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. From this whole process, Henry Kissinger expected Israel to repel the Arab invaders like in the 6 Days War and use this war to shift American foreign policy to try to go towards a more neutral. But the U.S. will supply weapons to Israel, about $2 billion worth of arms, approving a massive resupply to help them. Will also intervene diplomatically, and in response to this, the Arab members of OPEC are going to announce a cut in oil production, and when Nixon authorized more aid to Israel, Saudi Arabia will cut off oil shipments to the United States, put an embargo. People lost their manufacturing jobs. Oil embargo led to a worldwide shortage of oil, and we go into a period of oil shortage. So consumer spending is going to go way down because the cost of gas goes up, raise the price for oil. Their prices are nearly doubling, closing pumps on weekends to try to cut out pleasure driving. Cost of manufacturing is going to go up, so spending goes down, unemployment goes up, and we go into a recession. 1974, a slowdown of economic activity, car sales go way down, and inflation is going to continue. President Ford passed a tax cut to help with consumer spending. President Carter is going to try to use high interest rates to keep the economy down, and tax cuts will help. And 1979, the Iranian Revolution caused another surge in oil prices. With the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, OPEC doubles the price of oil. Gas, for the first time, goes up over $1 per gallon, whereas before all of this, it had been about 35 cents a gallon. And so what was referred to as the twin oil shocks are going to leave the economy a little bit worse for wear. So trying to find some alternatives during these oil shortages or energy crisis, Ford is going to encourage production. He said the U.S. is running out of fossil fuels. We've relied on them pretty heavily and wants a greater production of coal, maybe nuclear power plants, remove price controls on oil and natural gas, whereas Carter wants to push conservation, stressing price controls, gas rationing, wanted consumption of oil to go down. Trying to favor, Republicans are going to favor expanding supplies, fuel price controls, greater use of nuclear energy, whereas Democrats are going to use price controls and conservation and rationing as a policy. Congressional legislation that comes out of this is encouraging production, with the Alaskan pipeline for production would encourage or bring in an additional 1.5 million barrels a day to American consumers. Also encourage conservation, gas rationing, begin price controls on domestic oil, mandated annual increases in gas mileage to produce more fuel-efficient cars, and oil imports are going to increase slowly throughout the decade. But the energy problem will continue. All right, so like I said, inflation, oil prices drive inflation. Price of goods goes way up. Price of an automobile goes up 72%. Milk went from 28 to 59 cents a quart. Many prices overall industries were doubling. Attempted to bring in some government control, record high interest rates of about 20%. The Federal Reserve Board had wanted to curtail the amount of money in circulation, so we have tight money policy, which drove up interest rates. And we have a big shift in our world economy as well. We went from being the leader in 13 different industries to just 7, declining compared to Japan and European competitors. Our heavy industry, steel industry, takes a hit as Europe and Japan are producing more steel efficiently. So many of our own steel mills will close, which meant the loss of thousands of jobs. And high technology is going to continue. IBM is going to sell more computers all over the world, and business is going to start to diversify. Conglomerates, corporations are going to combine development of silicon microchips, all of that during this time period. Private lives and public issues become a big thing. Traditional families are going to break way to more diverse living arrangements that we'll go into. Number of working women increases, so do their wages, and the gay rights movement emerges, demanding an end to discrimination.